Hi guys, this is the Clear English Corner, and I'm Keenyn, your personal American English pronunciation coach. In this lesson, we're talking again about the most common contractions in American English. Our focus today is contracting the word not. If you want to sound more natural and native when speaking English, using contractions is an absolute must. This lesson is part of a three-part series where we're focusing on the top 5 most common contractions in American English so that you know which forms you should focus on. In our first lesson, we practiced contracting the present form of to be, or is, are, and am. Today, we're practicing not, and in our third and final lesson, we'll practice the word will. So let's dive in and practice contracting that little word not. So most of the time, a native speaker is not going to fully pronounce the word not. Instead, it becomes n. Now, this is a funny sound in and of itself. It's not pronounced nt. Instead, the T is held. It's not popped. So instead of hearing nt, you hear n. But what is actually happening inside the mouth in order to make this sound? So the air is actually resonating in the nose and stopping in the throat. So you get the nasal quality of the n with the stopping of the T. N. Let me slow it down. Try it with me. So you also hear this sound in words that have the NT together. For example, student, different, government, important. Also point, parent, moment. So the n sound is just another one of those tricky American English sounds to work on. And the word not becomes n most of the time, unless you're emphasizing something. I'm not interested. I do not want to know about it. Also, there's 2 ways to make the present form of to be negative. So, for example, you are not could become you're not or you aren't. He is not could become he's not or he isn't. It is not could become it's not or it isn't. So you can go either way on making those present forms of to be negative. What you would never say is you're n't or he's n't, right? Okay, moving on. For more examples of the negative forms of to be sure to grab the practice PDF that goes along with this lesson by clicking on the link in the video description. So contracting this super common word, not, from not to n, can really help you sound more natural in your spoken English. She is not trying very hard definitely doesn't sound as smooth as she isn't trying very hard. So let's practice contracting this word not in its most common forms. Here we go. So is not becomes isn't. That isn't funny. That isn't funny. This isn't the best idea. This isn't the best idea. Isn't the meeting at 9? Isn't the meeting at 9? Why isn't this on? Why isn't this on? It isn't that simple. It isn't that simple. Are not becomes aren't. Why aren't you going? Why aren't you going? Aren't you hungry? Aren't you hungry? Those aren't mine. Those aren't mine. We aren't talking about that. We aren't talking about that. They're coming this weekend, aren't they? They're coming this weekend, aren't they? Aren't you worried? Aren't you worried? Was not becomes wasn't. It wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth it. I hope she wasn't offended. I hope she wasn't offended. It wasn't so bad. It wasn't so bad. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't going to say anything. I wasn't going to say anything. Were not becomes weren't. Weren't. Be glad you weren't there. Be glad you weren't there. We weren't ready. We weren't ready. They weren't expecting that. They weren't expecting that. You weren't saying much. You weren't saying much. We weren't fooled. We weren't fooled. Cannot becomes can't. Can't. Now, I know there's a lot of confusion on this word, particularly when trying to differentiate it with can versus can't. And don't worry, I have another video to help you with this. So you'll definitely want to check that out. But for now, back to can't. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. That can't be right. That can't be right. You can't imagine. You can't imagine. I can't help it. I can't help it. You can't remember? You can't remember? Do not becomes don't. Don't. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Why don't we go out? Why don't we go out? Don't forget your lunch. Don't forget your lunch. Why don't you just ask her? Why don't you just ask her? I really don't know. I really don't know. Does not becomes doesn't. Doesn't. She doesn't like those. She doesn't like those. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. That doesn't sound good. That doesn't sound good. He said he doesn't care. He said he doesn't care. This thing doesn't work. This thing doesn't work. Did not becomes didn't. Didn't. I don't know. I really like this word. Didn't. Didn't. He didn't even try. He didn't even try. She didn't make it. She didn't make it. We didn't have that back then. We didn't have that back then. It didn't work out. It didn't work out. They said they didn't like it. They said they didn't like it. Will not becomes won't. Not wilt. Won't. Won't. It won't change anything. It won't change anything. I won't keep you long. I won't keep you long. You won't know the difference. You won't know the difference. He won't tell me. He won't tell me. We won't be there until 7. We won't be there until 7. Could not becomes couldn't. Couldn't. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't sleep. You couldn't see a thing. You couldn't see a thing. She couldn't decide. She couldn't decide. It couldn't be better timing. It couldn't be better timing. He couldn't let it go. He couldn't let it go. Would not becomes wouldn't. Wouldn't. They probably wouldn't believe me. They probably wouldn't believe me. He wouldn't go for that. He wouldn't go for that. You wouldn't have enough room. You wouldn't have enough room. I wouldn't lie about that. I wouldn't lie about that. Wouldn't that be fun? Wouldn't that be fun? Should not becomes shouldn't. Shouldn't. It shouldn't be this hard. It shouldn't be this hard. We shouldn't talk about this here. We shouldn't talk about this here. You shouldn't be so hard on yourself. You shouldn't be so hard on yourself. Shouldn't we discuss this first? Shouldn't we discuss this first? I shouldn't have said anything. I shouldn't have said anything. Have not becomes haven't. Haven't. I haven't answered yet. I haven't answered yet. We haven't had enough time. We haven't had enough time. I haven't spoken with her about it. I haven't spoken with her about it. You haven't said much. You haven't said much. We haven't seen it. We haven't seen it. Has not becomes hasn't. Hasn't. This hasn't been easy. This hasn't been easy. He hasn't been around much lately. He hasn't been around much lately. She hasn't gotten back to me yet. She hasn't gotten back to me yet. It hasn't been that long. It hasn't been that long. He hasn't told anyone yet. He hasn't told anyone yet. And had not becomes hadn't. Hadn't. I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't thought of that. Why hadn't she called? Why hadn't she called? They hadn't noticed the change. They hadn't noticed the change. If only I hadn't said that. If only I hadn't said that. She hadn't even started last time I checked. She hadn't even started last time I checked. All right, so there you have it, a little practice with contracting the word not. You'll definitely want to work through this lesson a few more times as you perfect using this contracted form. Before you work through the lesson again, be sure to grab the practice PDF that goes along with this lesson. Just click on the link in the video description to grab the practice PDF. It includes all of the different forms we've covered in this lesson, their IPA transcriptions, as well as all the practice sentences. And remember, if you haven't already, be sure to check out the first lesson in this series where we practice contracting is, are, and am. And definitely be on the lookout for the next lesson in this series where we'll practice contracting the word will. Well, that's a wrap for this lesson. I hope you found it helpful. If you did, please be sure to leave a thumbs up and definitely share with your friends. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss a single lesson coming from the Clear English Corner. As always, thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.